Movie buff specialist Phil and John are back, and we are on our seventh episode, number 94 of our top 100 movies. And I have to say that this might be the most particular week that John and I have. That is for sure. Two movies that are very much acquired tastes. Let's put it that way. And I think it says a lot about movies that you're going to see further up on this list, but are probably more popular, fit into these two, Barcelona and Darkman. These are the two movies that we're going to be talking about. This Barcelona from 1994 is my number 94. John's number 94 is Darkman, the Sam Raimi movie from 1990. John, welcome. This was my first time watching Darkman. From what I understand, you've watched Barcelona twice.
Yeah, I had to watch Barcelona twice this week, Phil, just to get an idea of how I actually felt about this movie. I watched it once and I was like, okay, yeah, like it was a good movie. And then a couple days later, I was like, did I actually like that movie? Mm-hmm. So I had to watch it again.
Yeah, I get it. I totally get it. I totally understand it. This was only the second time I've seen the movie, and I have to say, I think when I eventually revamp my top 100 list at some point, Barcelona is probably going to be a lot higher for me. I love this movie. I love how much it dives into the American idiosyncrasies and things like that. I think it's really fascinating. It amazes me that this was made in 1994 about the Cold War era. And let's be real, US and European opinions have really not changed all that much in the last 27 years.
No, not at all. And I mean, even speaking as like our token Canadian here, I can definitely say there is a lot of American opinions or opinions of Americans that are presented in this movie that Canadians also agree with.
Yes, and I am very interested in how that conversation is going to go. Darkman, the first time watching it, not my genre, but I did quite enjoy it. We're going to start with Barcelona, though, because I'm going to be honest, I don't think I could talk about Darkman without talking about Barcelona first, because I know you messaged me and you said, I had to watch it twice, and I saw your review on Letterboxd, and it made me laugh because I knew that this was going to be probably the weirdest one we were going to discuss because you're Canadian. And that's not a knock. Don't worry. No. It's just the fact that being from two different countries, you're supposed to get two very different perspectives in this movie. I think Whit Stillman's script is phenomenal. I think he does it on purpose. I think he wants you to look in a mirror as an American and say, is everything really that great? But also still say, there's still some things we do pretty well. And I think there is that European influence where it's like, you know what, you guys suck. And then also bring in, though, those aspects of Ramon being like, well, I didn't want you to almost die. Some golden lines in here. I hope you at least enjoyed the style of it, even if you didn't necessarily enjoy the message, because later on in this series, even though it's not in my top 100, it will serve as a replacement film. I do have The Last Days of Disco, which was the second movie, or the third movie in the trilogy, the movie that followed this one up. This one was following up Metropolitan, which I said at the end of last week. Don't know if that matters to anybody or not, but it did. Anyway, all of that being said, John, hit me with some stuff here.
So, I do think this film got better on a second watch. I think I knew more what to expect going into it on a second watch, which led me to appreciate certain things about it more when I watched it the second time. For one thing, there is so much dialogue in this movie. This movie is like 98% stream of conscious thought, just go, go, go. So much talking, everyone literally just speaking what's on their mind at all times. And even as someone who really enjoys that, who gets that aspect of it, I couldn't really appreciate the silent moments in the film the first time I watched it because I wasn't prepared. Because first off, the biggest silent moment comes at like the very beginning of the movie when they're like driving around Barcelona. So I couldn't really appreciate it because I didn't know what to expect coming later. But I definitely appreciated it a lot more on the second viewing. This is a wild movie. It's because it goes with that stream of consciousness kind of idea there, where it's just talk. And I don't know. I almost got like Lynchian vibes from some of the dialect in it because it was such mundane dialogue, kind of being escalated to this level of like high art in a way. I still don't fully know how to respond to this movie.
I feel like that's just Whit Stillman in general. So Whit Stillman, as far as I know, has made 4 movies. And I might be wrong, but I believe he made 4 movies. There might be another one lumped in there that I just haven't seen, but I believe it's 4. Metropolitan, this movie, Barcelona, which is the second in that trilogy, The Last Days of Disco, and then he didn't make a movie for like 20-something years, and then he made Love and Friendship with Kate Beckinsale. And what's interesting about Whit Stillman is he is not, in my opinion, a phenomenal director. But he's a great writer who every line of dialogue has that biting undertone of, I know this is what you're thinking. Like when an American gets called a fascist in their uniform, and it's like, yo, we literally fought against the fascists with you. Of course, we're not fascist, but it's that of course that's what he's going to say. If he's referring to the movement by Benito Mussolini, then obviously that's not what I'm a part of. If he's referring to whatever, like he describes it. And I think what Whit Stillman does is he puts it all out there. And I think it's all defined in that one conversation that Chris Eigeman has, Ted and Fred, Chris Eigeman and Taylor Nichols. I think they're played perfectly because they make them such assholes, but they're played perfectly. And when Chris Eigeman says, you don't really get to know, you always hear about the subtext, but you never hear what's above that. What is that? And he goes, it's the text. But you never think about what is the text. And I think what Whit Stillman does is he lays it out as the text. There's not much subtext in these movies because he's not really leaving much room for subtext, because he's just saying it all and saying, look, if you don't like us, then this is what we think too. And if you do like us, this is what we think of you. This is what you think of us. I think he just lays into it and says, screw subtext. I'm going to make a movie about 2 Americans kind of lost in Barcelona, trying to figure it out, surrounded by Europeans that they don't understand and that really do not understand them.
Yeah, and you kind of prepared me for this movie saying it's closer to a stage play, and it definitely is. The dialogue used in the movie is much more stage play-esque than in most movies were, even in 1994. I even wrote down a note, and it said, nothing matters outside the dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
You really don't need to watch this movie as long as you're listening to it.
Yeah.
Which is crazy to say about a movie. Yes, the visuals obviously add to it, but the dialogue is so important to understand what's going on in this movie that you can almost get away without watching.
I would say there's 3 moments that you need the visual for. Number 1 is at the beginning when they're doing Barcelona, the end of the Cold War, whatever. And it's like so funny. And like, it says all this stuff. And then it comes up with the text and it says the USO, whatever. And it just blows up. That just tells you this is going to be a dark humor movie. You need to see that. Number 2 is when they're driving around Barcelona. And every time they drive past this epic monument that's absolutely gorgeous, Chris Eigeman going, okay. Okay. Like he's just so nonchalant. And then 3rd is when he smashes the ants. I feel like that's the only other time you need to be watching it, because when he smashes the ants, the first time I was watching this was drinking water and I did a literal spit take because I was laughing so hard. It's such a pompous ass move, but it's just this dark humor. Those are the only 3 moments. So I do agree with you. The only other reason that you need to be able to see this movie is because Taylor Nichols, is so obsessed with trying to date a plain and homely woman that you need to understand what the women actually look like in this movie and which ones are plain and homely, and the fact that he ends up sleeping with arguably one of the hottest women who's ever been in a movie. So it's just funny that that's what this movie really does come down to.
Yeah, absolutely. And that actually kind of brings in some of this. Like we said, there's not much subtext in here. But one of the themes of the movie is definitely this approach to sex and love and the difference between the American approach to it and the European approach to it. And we see Ted be like, no, I don't want to sleep with attractive women anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I only want to sleep with someone who I have a chance of marrying. And it's just completely thrown for this loop when we're constantly told by all these European women that they're sleeping with multiple men.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Montserrat's sleeping with Ramon, and he's doing the American thing, which is, but why would you sleep with him? He's a douche. He's an ass. We don't like him. He's sleeping with all these other women, blah, blah, blah. And she's like, well, yeah, I never broke up with him. Like, what are you talking about? As she's sleeping with him. So it's like, yeah, this is just like what it is. And Ted just cannot wrap his mind around that at all. It really is this just reflection. And this Ted is a salesman. What Whit Stillman is saying to you is he's selling you on both the European and the American way. And I will say this, for as much as we hear in the news and things along those lines about like Americans and Americanism and things along those lines, I do believe that there are Americans who really appreciate America and Europe and kind of want to know how they can mesh those two things. They don't want to go full 100% European and they don't want to be full 100% American. How can they mesh those two things? Because like I worked in international sales for movies, and whenever you'd go to Europe, it was like this great, amazing thing. You'd fall in love with the aspect of it, but then there'd be certain things that you just weren't into. And I think what Whit Stillman is saying to you is like, both of these things have their very good parts, but both of these things also have their not so good parts. It's just that Chris Eigenman is kind of the one who is exemplified here as the not so good parts, which doesn't really help.
Yeah, I think that entire idea is really summed up when they're talking about what they call Americans and the term used for Americans and how people get mad at you for sort of saying you're an American because what about South Americans? They're also American. They come from the Americas. And this whole idea of, oh, well, you're North American. It's like, but that doesn't differentiate us from Canada at all. Mm-hmm. And it's like, maybe the real problem is in the syntax of the fact that you're using the phrase American to classify yourself.
Yeah, it's the fact that it says United States of America. It's not United States of something else. And then that's what brings this whole thing in. But as an American, and I'll keep saying American, John, I don't even think about it. And I think that's what this movie is also doing, is I think this movie is drawing attention to all these things that you don't really even think about, but that are relevant. So for instance, one of the stupidest lines of dialogue in this movie, or the stupidest conversations, but I love it. And it's something that I talk about to my friend all the time. Am I shaving in the wrong direction? Have I been shaving in the wrong direction my entire life? And there are so many moments of that where it's like, oh my God, like which way am I actually going? And it's those little things that you don't really think about that this movie brings up to you. And it's saying, what if you really did start to dwell on these things? What if you were so neurotic that this was the conversation that you were having with your friend? And I think it's fascinating. I mean, half the stuff that Ted says to whether it's his secretary or whatever her role is in this, I'm laughing because he's so pathetic. But also he's saying these things, and when he's reading his little book and all of that, it's things that people probably think, but they never actually express. And Whit Stillman, again, gets rid of the subtext and says, here's the text. Here's what I want you to think, and here's what I want you to ponder as you watch this movie.
Yeah, definitely. And Whit Stillman also does this thing where he hides things at the beginning of the movie and that you think are just inconsequential, and they come up again later in the movie. Like when Ted's explaining him reading about like business philosophy and stuff and like getting more efficient at being a salesman with the red dots. And then way later in the movie, Fred comes into his office like, what are all these red dots on your paper?
And what's another thing? And that's one point, but another thing that he's doing with that is the red ants. So it's almost like the red ants taking over. He's learning this thing that now is outside of what he learned as an American. And now it's infiltrating. Like the color red has a big meaning in this, being that it's at the end of the Cold War. And one of my favorite lines, and whether people find it funny or not, I have a very dark sense of humor, and I think it's brilliant, is when Fred says when they're talking about how America's too violent. And he says, no, we're not more violent than anybody. And she says, but with all the shootings, he goes, oh, the shootings, we're not more violent. We're just better shots. And what happens at the end of the movie? He gets shot in the head and doesn't die. It's this huge punchline to this joke that's really not funny, but it's being said with such like a pompousness that it's hard not to laugh at it because it's just so ridiculous. And what I love about Chris Eigeman's performance in this, and what I love about his performance in all of Whit Stillman's movies, he's in Metropolitan and he's in Last Days of Disco, playing different characters though. What I love about his performance is that you believe that this is what he believes. Like this, he totally owns that. Yeah, this is how I think. I really believe that we're not more violent. We're just better shots. I really believe that I'm not a thief, despite the fact that I have never once paid you back your money. And I stole that guy's old crow. He really just is so in this role. I think he just does such a great job. And yeah, Whit Stillman's script, it has so many punchlines to jokes that you just don't think are going to be set up.
Yeah. And it's really, you mentioned at the top of the podcast where it's just really interesting looking at this movie from different national perspectives, because I do think there are moments where Ted says something that's just like so brazenly American and Americanized that I was groaning watching a lot of this movie. Because it's just like, for example, that line that you just mentioned, we're just better shots. Great line, incredibly witty. But oh my God, the groan I let out when I heard that.
And you know what's funny though? And I think this is what Whit Stillman was trying to do. I would bet that at 90% of the lines where you groaned, I probably went, yeah, that's right. And I think that's what he was trying to do. Because while he's also, a lot of people who make movies, they just are those types of world travelers. They want to get into a society. They want to be around everything. That's just how they are. And so I do think that Whit Stillman loves Europe. I think he has a great appreciation for Europe. But I do believe that part of him also thinks those things that he's saying in this movie. And one of my favorites is at the end when they're talking about the ants in the ant farm and how everybody looks at America as an ant farm and what they're doing and all of that. The problem is a lot of the people who write about it just don't like ants. And I do think that there is a truth to that. I'm not saying it's totally true, but I do think there's a truth to the fact that America's always under a microscope because they are this big American exceptionalism and blah, blah, blah. And so they're always under a microscope. And when something goes wrong, they're hit so much harder than if another country has that happen. And I think a lot of that just comes from a lot of this distaste or this disgust in some cases for a lot of the American ways of life from other countries. And I do think that, if this guy Ramon, half the stuff he's saying, he really is making up. And I don't even know if these incidents are real or if they're just totally made up, but there's a lot of moments in this movie he's talking about the sinking of the Maine and things along those lines. And Ted and Fred know they're lies, but they can't convince anybody else there that they're lies. And even when Ted and Fred just try to make an analogy about the ants at the party, what do Ramon and his friends get mad at? Why are you reducing them to ants? Now we're only ants. Oh, now like they're not even people. And that's not what the point is. Everything is ant size. But I just think those little observations of, yeah, a lot of people who are talking about how bad America is doing don't really like America or don't like the idea of America. It's not everybody, but a lot of the more vocal people, the people who are working in the presses in these other countries, that tends to be the case sometimes. So it especially like, I feel like this is a very relevant movie because we just came through COVID and the craziness with the Trump and Biden election and all of that. And so I think there's so much disgust for America right now with a lot of what's going on. Some of it's warranted, some of it isn't. And I just think that, but it's always under a microscope. And I also think that's why ants ultimately are what he chooses in this movie, because putting an ant under a microscope, you normally fry it. And I think that's what he's kind of saying here.
Yeah, and it's really the timing of this movie, because we are at that point in the early 90s and the late 80s when this movie is taking place, at this point of American globalization, right? With the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. We really saw America at that point kind of spread out more throughout the world. And that is the only environment, I think, where this movie truly works. Is like, that has to happen in order for this movie to work. And it had to continue happening for that movie to still be relevant today.
Absolutely. And it still has. I mean, I was watching a Disney documentary, like a Imagineering or something not too long ago. And they were talking about when they tried to open Disneyland Paris, the French came out and were like totally against it because it was going against what their culture was. It was Americanizing so much. And, you know, obviously you don't want to get to this point of what was going on in, you know, ancient history. But also when you start to look like the Roman Empire, the British Empire, the sun never sets on the British Empire. Well, Britain was all about expanding and putting their influence on places. I mean, I don't know much about history, but I'm sure there's plenty of places that the French have ownership of that aren't in France or Spain, where it's funny that this is Barcelona, Spain going into Africa and things along those lines. That all really happened. But it's almost like because what's happening now, because it is America that is the influence, it's so much more frowned upon. But if you look at any history of any country that is a first world country, there are instances of trying to put your influence onto other smaller, lesser world. I don't know how you would call that, but second or third world countries.
No, for sure. Less developed countries. And
less
like
developed.
That.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I think that's why the timing of this movie is so important, because it is coming from a time where Europeans were pretty scared of Soviet expansion further on, like challenging their way of life, only to see it kind of like replaced with an Americanization of their life instead. And I think one of the big things that really shows that in this movie is like the discussion of hamburgers in this movie.
Yeah.
And how everyone from Spain and in Barcelona are all talking about how disgusting hamburgers are. And Ted and Fred are just like, well, you've never had an American hamburger. Mm-hmm. You just don't understand it because you haven't had the real thing.
And I love that because what does he say? He says, you know that Americans love hamburgers. You eat a hamburger in Europe, it doesn't taste good, so now you think Americans are idiots because they like that. But you've never had it in America. And I will say, the first time I went to Europe and I had a hamburger, I was like, whoa, this doesn't taste the same. Not that it's bad, but it surely does not taste the same as an American hamburger does. There's differences in the meats. So I do think that that's interesting, where it's an interesting perspective of if you think that an entire population likes something that you know is not good, you're going to think lesser of that population. And I think what we're seeing nowadays with America and, you know, with the fighting back against a lot of the socialists and you know, those ideas, I think that a lot of Americans feel that exactly what it felt like was happening in the late 80s and 90s in Europe is what America feels like Europe, or that these other socialist countries are trying to do to America. And so I think that's why you're seeing a pushback now, and also why I feel like this movie will be relevant as long as Europe and America have different political structures. I think this movie will always be relevant because there's always going to be that idea of, I don't want you to change how we are. And I also think, and you know, I'm not the most like pro-America person. I definitely like living in America. And I think that there's some very good things about living in America, but anywhere you live is going to have its pros and its cons. But I do think that that's what also Whit Stillman is trying to show the beauty of, is that Europe and America are great because you can go from one to the other and you can go from one to the other and you can appreciate the differences. First thing I noticed the first time I went to Europe, that America has no freaking history. We have no history, because when you go to Europe and you're walking around Athens or you're walking around Berlin or you're walking around Cannes, it's this different perspective of just, oh my God, like look at how old this stuff is and look at how it's here. And you go to America and yeah, we have our monuments and we have things like that. But most of the things that are America are skyscrapers or natural formations. That's what most of the monuments in America are. And so there's really no history there. And I think that's why, as an American, I love Europe. I'm fascinated by Europe. And I also love America. And I think that's what this movie is trying to say is like, yes, Ted leaves America to go work a job in Europe, but he just cannot completely buy into that European way of life. And there's still something just holding him back.
Yeah, and how much better his life would be if he could just accept that there are pros and cons to both sides. Really, when you think about it, this movie is pretty anti-nationalist.
I agree. I 100% agree.
It's really just like trying to say it's okay to be different, and this is what you look like when you try to say it isn't.
Yeah. And it's this whole idea. What I love, one of my favorite scenes of this movie is just at the very end when Ramon walks up to Fred and, you know, he's like, I'm sorry if anything I wrote could have possibly had this happen to you. That was not my intention. And it's this olive branch of, look, I don't agree with the way you live. You're never going to agree with the way I live, but I still don't want you to die. And that's when war happens. And I think that's something that, you know, in 2021, in 2020, whenever somebody listens to this, in 2022, whatever it is, I think that's something that I hope that as a world, as we come out of COVID and all of that, people realize is you still don't want these people to die. You might disagree, but you don't want people to die because that's when there's problems. And I think that that's what this movie does a really good job of is like, yeah, he wrote all these bad things about how he's a spy and all of that. And I love that the guy at the I can't even think of what the word is, but the guy at the embassy, he says, well, we're mad at you because you got caught. Why are you like, even though he's not a spy, they're more mad at him for acting like a spy. I don't know. Like at the end of the day, he still doesn't want him to die. Like he realizes like, ooh, this is like a very serious thing. And I didn't want this to happen to you.
Yeah. But Ramon also specifically says, I'm not sorry I wrote this.
Yes, exactly.
I'm sorry it brought harm to you, but this is everything that I believe in, right? And that's the beauty of this, is that it's being able to accept the opinions and the ideas of others and being able to accept the differences between your opinions and theirs, but still not wishing ill upon each other.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's something that, you know, we're struggling with a little bit right now, just because I think tensions are so high. Because it's just been a crazy year. We're almost at the year anniversary at the time of recording. And I think that people are just, the tensions are so high. But I think a movie like this is one of those movies where you don't have to sit down and watch it and agree with any of the characters. You can sit down and watch it and be disgusted with everybody. But I still think it gets its message across. Something we barely even talked about in this movie is the women. The women are all incredibly strong characters. Mira Sorvino in this movie, I forget what her name is, but stealing the money. And not really even thinking anything different of it. And then you have Greta, who at the end of the movie comes in, is a very big part of this movie. Montserrat is a great character. I love Montserrat. And I love how at the end of the movie, like there they all are eating hamburgers at a lake house. It's literally the most American thing you can do, but it's also the first scene that we're really seeing in America. So it should be the most American thing because essentially for this entire movie, we've seen the most European things that people can do. When Chris Eigenman tries to get them all to do the limbo and everybody's just like, what is wrong with this guy? And they're all just staring at him. It's that fish out of water thing. I wore tan pants in Berlin. I looked like an idiot. It's just that fish out of water thing where you don't even think twice about it. And then it happens.
Well, it's also the idea of like time in that scene too, where they're like, it's too early for dancing. And Fred's just like, what are you talking about? It's a party. Like, you dance.
Yeah, who cares?
But it's also that idea that like, I feel like there's almost a North American idea that like, I don't know, 10 o'clock hits and the night's over. You know? Right? Whereas like, Europeans are eating their dinner at that time.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And it's just like different ways of managing time between the cultures and stuff. And that's part of that culture shock. As well as like the stark contrast between Ted listening to Pennsylvania 65000 and Vinyl Hampton.
Yes.
Right? Like
yes.
These stark contrasts. And that is what Whit Stillman does so well in this movie is he puts those contrasts there for you to see, for you to analyze while the characters are analyzing them.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that's important is that the characters are also analyzing along with you. I do think that Stillman takes a neutral stance in this movie.
Mhm.
Even I think Chris Eigeman's character grows as this movie goes on, and we see him at one point even say when the lady says to him, "But there's still too much violence and there's still too much shooting." He says, "Yeah, it's a problem." But he leaves it
Mhm.
at that. It's like, yes, it's a problem, but we have other things that are worth accepting and worth being a part of. And it always makes me laugh. I mean, I shouldn't laugh, but it makes me laugh in like an ironic way of it's 2021 and people act like all these issues are brand new. You know, we
Mhm.
see on because now people have Twitter and Instagram, and so everything is brand new. This shit has been around forever. This is just how it has been. And you watch a movie like this that is made in 94, but set in the late 80s, and it's the exact same conversations that you would see in a movie about this made in 2021 about this same topic. It's the same thing. And I think that's what's really, I think this movie is a timeless movie. I really do. And like I said, right now it's at my number 94. We'll see how the rest of these movies go. This was only the second time I watched it. It had enough of a profound impact on me after one viewing to put it in my top 100. I really do believe that this is going to be a movie that's just going to climb and climb and climb for me as it goes on.
Yeah, I can see that happening for me too. I don't know how often I'll revisit it, just because like after that first watching, I didn't think I would watch this movie again, and lo and behold, I've already watched it twice. So who am I to judge?
Yeah, it grows. And I think that's a lot of these types of movies. And this is, I know we're already at a half hour, John. I feel like we could talk about this movie for an hour easy because it's a deep movie. There's a lot of conversation to be had. But I will say, one thing I was very open about is that I love these 90s low budget independent movies. I think the 2000s, 2000 teens, they got into anybody with a pretty camera could shoot something pretty and there wasn't much of a story, but it looked good. I'd rather a movie not look very good and have this over the top dialogue, early Noah Baumbach, Whit Stillman, early Wes Anderson. That's what these movies were. They were what they were saying. Early Kevin Smith, Chasing Amy is one of the most on the nose movies ever, but it's so ahead of its time and it works. Kicking and Screaming with Noah Baumbach, absolutely ridiculous movie. The things they talk about, but it's one of those movies where they're just talking. This is what people do talk about sometimes. And this movie for me, it just hits that. I love that it's just about talking about things that people don't always know how to express.
Yeah, and it's a movie that's really rare to find nowadays. Nearly 20 years later, 30 years later. Oh my God.
Almost 30.
Nearly
Yeah, we're at 27 years. Yeah.
It's just people don't appreciate the language as much anymore because the language is more in the visuals nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely. People are almost bored by dialogue, but to me, you get dialogue where it rips off the page like this. There's so many lines we didn't even talk about. I could have went on and on and on and on, but it just works. It just works. But somehow we hit a half hour already. So it's time to jump over to the other side. Complete opposite movie.
Oh, very
Complete
much.
opposite as much as it can be. John's number 94, Darkman. John, take it away.
So, context for Darkman. Darkman is Sam Raimi's follow-up to Evil Dead 2. So he's made arguably one of the best horror comedy movies of all time. He follows it up with this before he makes the sequel to that movie, An Army of Darkness. And it is... it's not quite a B movie, because it definitely... like, you can feel the budget in this movie, but it still has those campy characteristics to it. Aside from the two lead characters who are crazy well-known actors now, but were not as well-known back in 1990, in Liam Neeson and Frances McDormand. This movie has a bunch of nobodies. You'd be very hard-pressed to be able to name any of the other actors in this movie. But it's such a fun, campy take on a superhero story without being a superhero story. And it's absolutely ridiculous. I think the best thing that sums up this movie is the opening scene where we have the two gangs confronting each other. And then all of a sudden, the guy with the wooden leg, his leg is a gun. And at that moment, you know exactly what type of movie you're in for.
Yeah, you know exactly what's going to happen the rest of the time. Now, I will say I enjoyed this movie a lot more than I thought I was going to enjoy it. I gave this 3 stars on Letterboxd. This is not my genre in any way, shape, or form. So that's kudos to Sam Raimi, because there were enough nods at me of like, yeah, I know what I'm doing here. I know that I'm making an over-the-top, campy type movie, because I don't like superhero movies. I just don't. This one was a little bit better for me because it had that Deadpool feel of kind of like, it's the anti-hero more than the hero necessarily. And I don't really like campy movies. I like The Evil Dead. I like The Evil Dead 2, but I don't love those movies. I don't like the Tim Burton Beetlejuice. I don't like those types of things. I don't like the Tim Burton Batmans. Like, to me, that just doesn't do it. I don't like that late 80s, early 90s style. But this movie does have those aspects of, you really do care for Liam Neeson. And I think that's a really hard thing to do, because Sam Raimi creates this character out of nothing. It's not like he had a comic book to base this on. He just wanted to make this. And so to still make us care so much about about Liam Neeson, I think is a really impressive feat.
Absolutely. And part of it does come from the fact that, like, Liam Neeson's an incredible actor.
Mm-hmm.
And despite the fact that you very much get his accent in every single role he ever plays,
mm-hmm.
you still don't question it at all. And he still brings it emotionally. Like, this is a ridiculous movie. The concept of this movie is this guy had his flesh and nerves burned off. So now he wants revenge against the gang members who made that happen.
But nothing happens to his tongue or anything, just so everybody knows.
Nope, nothing happens. Nope.
No. Or his eyeballs. He still has his eyes.
Yeah. But, and there's that hospital scene where they just set it up. It's like, oh yeah, he can't feel anything. And because of that, he gets angry sometimes.
Yeah.
And like, that's the only explanation you need in this entire movie. That's it. Yeah. It's done. Explains everything that happens afterwards.
I feel that, and I think something that takes me out of superhero movies now, because I watched the Sam Raimi Spider-Mans. I liked them. The third one is horrible, but I liked the other two. And John, maybe you like the third one. I know you like The Last Jedi, and we're going to be talking about that later. So maybe you like Spider-Man 3 the most. I don't know. Maybe you're just crazy. But I do think that they take themselves a little too seriously nowadays. I feel that they try to get too into being a like respected film. We're going to get Oscars and stuff like that. Just be what you are. When Will Ferrell makes a movie, he just says, I'm going to look like an asshole for the next 2 hours of your life. Enjoy. And it works most of the time. There's some movies with Will Ferrell that aren't good, but for the most part, it works. I feel that superhero movies now, from the very rare few that I've seen, or just from watching a trailer, they try to be like, we're this profound thing, and this is what we do. You're really not. Like we just talked about Barcelona. I feel like that's a profound movie. I feel like there's a lot going on there. I feel like superhero movies, like, you're not going to get much profundity. I don't know what the word would be, but you're not going to get much in terms of profound, because I don't know what to put at the end of that word, by making a movie about Scarlett Johansson in leather running around as the Black Widow. Like, it doesn't matter. And I think that's what Sam Raimi did so well with the first 2 Spider-Men. And what he does really well in this movie is he's okay with not taking it super seriously. He's okay with knowing that he's making a comic book movie and that it's not meant to be this larger than life Oscar type movie, that it's just a movie that is meant to entertain and will have whatever message it has. And I think he does a really good job with that. And that's why he ends up having success with, not so much this movie. I don't think this was a commercial success by any means, but with the Spider-Man movie, when he does eventually make those movies, I think that he has a lot of success because he knows what he's doing, and he doesn't try to be more than what it is. For sure.
And I think the beauty of this movie is actually, I find this movie incredibly profound, despite the fact that it's just schlock full of camp.
I think this one's more profound than most. Yes.
Yeah. I think that really what it comes down to, the first time I ever watched this movie was in my grade 12 philosophy class. Mm-hmm. Don't ask me how.
I won't.
In a public school classroom, but the first time I watched it, I had to think of it philosophically, and I always have since. But there's so much identity thought that goes into this movie. What makes you a person? What makes you who you are? And it's so much based on existentialism and just who you are as a person that it's quite profound when you start digging into this movie. And one of the biggest scenes that I think really does it is the circus freak dance freak out that he has in the warehouse, where he's like, look at me dance, and all that. And he's just freaking out because he's like a freak. And then it's like, oh yeah, your skin's ready.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, yeah, there's definitely more to this one. Like I said, I mean, I just feel like a lot of these movies, a lot of just superhero origins in general are like, oh, well, now I'm becoming something that I wasn't meant to be. But a lot of that to me can just feel stale, because whether you can shoot spider webs out of your hand, or you can fly, or you're really good with a bow and arrow, or you just have a strong shield, or you know, whatever, I don't find it to be all that interesting. Whereas like when you have a guy who can change his face to look like anybody else, but it's not being done in a way to like save the world. It's being done in a way to just get back at these people. That's more interesting to me, because then this becomes a crime movie. And that's what I said when we talked about The Dark Knight a couple weeks ago. I like that. I like the darkness that is kept with superhero movies sometimes, that we're really just not necessarily seeing in a lot of the newer ones. And maybe we are, and maybe I'm just missing it, but I don't know. I just feel like it's better.
This movie focuses a lot on the human emotion side of it, where you're really feeling for Peyton and the fact that he has to ostracize himself. He was in a very serious relationship at the time that this accident happened, and he was in a coma. Several months passed. We don't even know the timeline of this movie. They don't ever tell us how much time has passed. We just know he's been dead for long enough that it's very sketchy when he shows up not being dead.
Yeah.
And it just, you're feeling so much for this character. And he's not going out on this murdering rampage either. He is going out, his full intention is to screw over the gang as much as possible.
Yeah, he wants to play games with them. I mean, we see the bald guy where he's not killing the bald guy. He wants to take the money, and then he wants the bald guy to get his fingers snipped off. You know, he wants the bald guy to suffer. And then the guy at the end of the movie who, whatever the villain's name is, I honestly don't remember, but he wants that guy to look bad when he's staring at the camera and he's holding up the grocery store or whatever, or whatever it is. He's doing that on purpose to try to, you know, he just wants revenge, but he doesn't want to go on a killing spree. He just wants revenge in like fun, unique ways, where every time it's kind of coming out as something different, which is more fun.
And then Sam Raimi can still justify when he does get pushed over the edge and he does get to the point where he is killing people, because there's this one line of dialogue that says, oh yeah, his emotions are pretty unstable because he can't feel anything.
Yeah. Exactly.
Right? And that's why he holds a guy's head up of a sewer from a sewer hole into traffic and lets it get run over by a truck. And
great scene.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
And why he can do these things in the warehouse where he's just like taking revenge and like having these people get blown up the same way he got blown up. And, you know, it's so fun. It's so fun. One of my favorite things about this movie, and really like plays into this idea of identity as a theme in this movie, are the scenes where Peyton is confronted with the person that he's wearing the mask of. And like Sam Raimi has Evil Dead 2, obviously, we'll talk about that much later. But Sam Raimi's really good with like doubling characters up. And he does it again in Army of Darkness after this. But it really shines in this, because you just get these moments where the revolving door scene at a Hong Kong restaurant, where it's just like, shoot him. No, shoot him. Yeah. And it's just like, who is it? And it's like, I'm not even sure which one's which at this point.
We lose track along with the other people, which is what I think really works, until his face starts to actually melt off. And something that I liked about this, and again, it leans into the campiness. We never really are told why it's only 99 minutes. We're never given a scientific explanation for why it's 99 minutes. Now, I feel in newer superhero movies, they would probably dwell on that. Why 99? Why not 100? What is it that happens? And, well, the molecular breakdown, blah, blah, blah. So now we can sound sciencey, so people who go to those movies and think that they're the smartest movies ever written can be like, wow, did you realize that? No, that's not real. I love that Sam Raimi doesn't even care. He's just like, yeah, 99 minutes. That's what happens. That's what happened. So yeah. And I love it.
Yeah.
I'm going to type to this guy.
This movie is so fun. It's another one of those fun movies. I swear, guys, my movies are going to start getting less fun as of next week.
Yeah.
But when it comes to this movie, Sam Raimi has this wild approach to the way his dialogue comes, and a lot of it comes from like these emotional snaps that characters have. Mm-hmm. One of my favorite scenes in this movie is "Take the fucking elephant."
Yeah.
Right, where it's just like, what is happening here? Mm-hmm. You are totally fine. Yeah, this guy's being a bit of a dick here, not giving you the elephant and everything. But now you're like freaking out at Julie, who is like the one person kind of keeping your humanity in check here. And the visuals Sam Raimi decides to use.
So bizarre. That was like the one scene that I could not handle.
It's just like, where did this come from? Oh my God, I love it so much.
Yeah. See, that's one of the things where you either buy into it or you don't. Like those moments I wasn't buying into when he had these crazy rage-filled things, but I could totally see why somebody who loves this movie would be so into those, where for me, I'm like, all right, now this is weird. Like one of the reviews that I read on Letterboxd, I thought was really funny, where it was like between what was it? It was between, I forget what it was, but it was like between something and Tim Burton's Batman lies Darkman. Mm-hmm. Because it's like between this bizarre thing and this other like just dark thing. Here is Darkman, this just crazy, like it's such an out there movie that, you know, I understand why it has more of a cult following than a real following. I understand why this movie didn't make very much money. I understand why Sam Raimi in general tends to be hit or miss at box offices and such. But still, if that's his style and if his fans are into that, then go for it, then do it. And that's what I respect about it. Even though I didn't like those parts and I was like, all right, now you're losing me, I still did enjoy the fact that he would go there with it, because he knows that his audience, the people who are going to go out and see Darkman, are people who are going to love that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that is one of the beauties of Sam Raimi as a director. Even as we've like seen this evolution of him, like we saw him kind of start out with like Evil Dead and Evil Dead 2, and then we get Darkman, which is a little more serious than those previous two entries, despite the fact that Evil Dead is supposed to be a very serious movie. And then like we got 2000s Raimi, where it was like Spider-Man and his like Japanese horror remakes.
Yeah.
Right? But we still get Raimi. And Raimi just has this signature touch to him. And maybe it's just the fact that everything he does has to have Bruce Campbell in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that just he's like in the very end of this movie.
Fantastic cameo at the end of this movie. But Sam Raimi, you can tell, is just having fun when he makes a movie.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I really enjoy about Darkman. That's what keeps me coming back to it, is the fact that this movie isn't just me having fun. It's the person who made this movie having fun.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's what a lot of these cult directors have going that other directors might not have going for them, is that like people love David Lynch because they just imagine what it must be like on a David Lynch set when they're doing the Red Room scenes, or, you know, in anything in the Twin Peaks reboot. Like I can't even imagine what that must have been like. Or when Richard Farnsworth even is riding on a tractor. What are we watching? Like David Lynch just leans into it. Wes Anderson leans into it. These culty directors have their thing where they build up their fan bases because the people just get enamored with their stories and what they're doing, but also with just kind of who that person is. People love that Wes Anderson dresses like a cartoon character. People love that. And I think that that's something with Sam Raimi where you can tell that he is throwing everything at the wall, and he never stopped making movies like he was an amateur trying to break in. That doesn't mean his movies are amateurish. It just means that he never stopped making Sam Raimi movies. You look at people like Fincher, you look at people like Christopher Nolan. They have become people who make movies that are Hollywood blockbusters. They have bought into that. And that's why their earlier movies are the ones that people talk about more generally. Because they feel the most like them. That's when they built up their fan bases, and then they became something else. Sam Raimi sort of became something else, but never lost touch with who Sam Raimi really was.
Yeah. And this movie is exactly who Sam Raimi is, because he does give us all aspects of everything in this movie. Because he does have scenes where it kind of has like that horror aspect. Again, we go back to this guy being held up out of the manhole scene, right? Like, that's a horrifying scene.
Yeah.
As he's being tortured underwater, and then it's like, okay, now you're going to get run over because I'm going to pretend I didn't hear what you said.
Yeah.
Right? And he has that slapstick comedy kind of, and that's kind of like those, like, that scene where, again, Peyton's getting angry and, like, the screen's breaking around him and things like that. And Sam Raimi brings it all together with just some incredible direction in this movie.
Yeah, I agree. And yeah, that scene with the torture in the water in the sewer or whatever it is, that's brutal. I mean, I was not expecting that at all, because I knew this movie was rated R, but I was just not expecting that. But he is a very talented director, and people don't get big followings because they just get lucky. These people do get big followings because they do have. I mean, I don't like Shane Carruth at all. I think Shane Carruth's a terrible director. He's the one who did Primer and Upstream Color. I think Upstream Color is an absolute disaster. But I still understand. I respect the fact that people love this guy. They just love him. And so, there is a talent there. And I think that that's something not that Sam Raimi, it was ever in doubt, but I think that's also why he was able to build up the way he did. And some of these other people who make one cult movie and then disappear, it might be because they don't actually have as much talent as Sam Raimi has, which he does really show off in this movie, because there are a lot of emotional scenes in this movie, despite the fact that the movie doesn't really have human beings. The main character is a human being who's now been through all this trauma, and it's not trying to be like a human drama.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost kind of like a Frankenstein monsters kind of approach to the character in this one, right? And I love the fact that the title of this movie makes absolutely no sense until you really think about it. Like, why is it called Dark? And if it wasn't for this last line of the movie where it's like, "I'm Darkman,"
It's so funny.
And it's just like, why? What does that mean? Because obviously it's alluding to the fact that the skin melts away after 99 minutes if it's not in the dark. Or is it that he's hiding his true self all the time? There's so much in the depths of this name itself. Why did you choose Darkman to be your identity? And what is that identity? Yeah,
I know. And so I was thinking that as I was watching it, because, obviously when you have Spider-Man, he got bit by a spider. So now he shoots spider webs. And when you have Captain America, he's Captain America. You get those. And so I was thinking about that while I was watching this, and it made sense when they said he does all this stuff, but he never really does anything at night. I thought that this was going to be a nighttime movie, and instead he's always going out during the day and giving himself a very specific window. So I do think it's more about this dark identity type thing where he's saying to himself, I'm not really a human anymore. I'm not really who I am anymore. And so now I've just become kind of this creature of the night, or this creature. I'm Darkman. You'll never know who I am, because what does it matter? And now somehow I'm Bruce Campbell.
Well, I mean, that's also part of the beauty of this movie, is you can make sequels to it without Liam Neeson. And there are 2 sequels to this movie.
So who plays the roles in the sequels?
I'm not sure. I've never personally seen them.
Really? Is that because they're just supposed to be bad? Is that also Sam Raimi or no?
I don't think so. Let me just double check here. But yeah, it's a wild movie with a premise that is just believable enough that you're like, okay, this makes sense. But once you start dissecting the premise, it makes no sense. No, the sequel is directed by Bradford May.
Never heard of Bradford May.
Yes, and Bradford May now. So it was The Revenge of Durant. for the
Okay.
return of
Oh,
Durant.
that's his name.
So,
It's Durant. I couldn't think of Durant.
Yeah. So Durant comes back as the villain in that.
Okay. So who plays and it's a different person playing.
It's Arnold Vosloo.
Never heard of him.
He is Amenhotep in The Mummy in 1999's The Mummy. He's the Mummy.
What's the name? Oh, he's the mummy. Oh, okay. I was trying to figure. I'm like, I didn't know that was the name of the mummy. Okay. So there you go. But yeah, I'll probably never seek those movies out. No offense
but it's wild. And it's just a premise of this was made in a time where you weren't thinking of making sequels. I mean, guess we were kind of getting to that point of sequels with the 80s, but like a movie like this, you didn't think you were really making a sequel to. But it left it open for it anyways, and they got made 5 years later.
I do think that was something that did start to happen with Back to the Future, which we talked about a couple weeks ago, and with Star Wars and things like that. I do think that the 80s did kind of leave the door open a lot more. And this was around the time where now you were going to have Terminator and this. And he had just, I think also he learned from making The Evil Dead and realizing that he was going to make an Evil Dead 2. Hey, I might as well just leave the door open. Why not? So that's a smart concept, but I think they had to have known that this movie wasn't going to make very much money, right?
I don't know. Like Evil Dead 2 is pretty popular.
But. That's true. And this style was so popular at the time, even though for me, like I just cannot understand it half the time.
It feels like the fun aspect of the 80s. Like we talked about the 80s when we were talking about Back to the Future and The Last Crusade. Those were very different 80s movies from this. This was that other type of 80s movie we were talking about that existed at the time.
Yeah.
And it's just like this low budget movie that really nailed home this fun feeling based on how campy it is.
And it's what's fascinating about the 80s is the movies that are remembered. Again, we talked about this, but it's never the Oscar winners. It's never even the ones that were nominated for Best Picture. It's always the movies that, Back to the Future, Indiana Jones, the 2 Star Wars that came out, and then these campy late 80s movies or your 80s horror movies when those started coming out. Like that's what's better remembered from this decade. And it's really the only decade where that's the case, because even though the 90s have movies like Fight Club and which isn't nominated for really anything at the time, and Seven, which wasn't nominated for really anything at the time, still the 90s is better remembered for movies like Silence of the Lambs and Fargo and Titanic and Saving Private Ryan.
Seems Phil's frozen a little bit here, but he's right. The 90s was kind of this time where we were really looking at these more award-winning films, and that's really persisted into this day, especially with Best Pictures and category being expanded into...
Right, I'm back, I think. John, how bad was it?
It was pretty bad. I started covering for you. It's okay.
Okay, good. As long as you were covering, what did you get to? Sorry, everybody. My internet has been, I will say this now, my internet has been absolutely atrocious today. I got to figure out what's going on because it was so bad all day.
So I was just saying that theme in the 90s where award films started to get a lot more recognition and how we really encapsulate decades has really persisted, especially with the point where we now have 10 Best Picture nominees now every year.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's something. I think that movies, it's a shame that they moved to 10. Because I will say this, I don't believe that a movie like Darkman or The Evil Dead or The Evil Dead 2 needs to be nominated for an Oscar. These movies are what they are. And I think the problem is now we get so worked up about, well, why aren't the superhero movies getting nominated for Best Picture? Or why the hell is Bohemian Rhapsody nominated for Best Picture? Because we've heard of Queen. Like, congratulations, one of the worst movies ever made. But we've heard of Queen, so now we must like this movie. Rami Malek puts in fake teeth and he wins an Oscar. Like, you've got to be kidding me. And so I feel like we're crossing over into this weird phase of we want the Oscars to be like they were going to make a best popular film category. You know what I call that? The box office winner of the year. Why do we need a best popular film? And obviously there was such backlash, they got rid of it. But I feel like Best Picture at the Oscars and things along those lines, Oscar movies, they should be their own thing. The 80s has bad ones of those.
Yes.
But it has really good understated movies or movies that people don't maybe have to seek out a little bit more.
Yeah, and these cult classics are just one of the best cinema going experiences you can have. We're going to talk about that in a few weeks when we get to a different movie on my list that has a very fun theatrical experience attached to it.
Yeah.
But if you get a chance to see this type of movie in a crowd, when we're allowed to do that, of people who are all just like-minded and enjoy this type of movie, you're going to have the most fun night of your life.
Yeah. It's why Rocky Horror Picture Show has lasted so long, and The Evil Dead and all of those movies. I mean, every time they play, people try to go and see them in a theater. That's what people want to do. I mean, people see them yearly whenever it happens. It's an event, it's an experience, and it's something people really enjoy doing. And I don't blame them. I mean, there's something enjoyable. I mean, I went and saw The Fellowship of the Ring in theaters recently in IMAX. I saw Lawrence of Arabia in theaters maybe 2 or 3 years ago. It's so much fun to see these movies that are classics, but also to see these movies that have cult followings, because the reason people are going to see them in a theater is because they already know they like it. They're not going to discover it the way that we discover new movies now. If I were to go to a theater and watch Judas and the Black Messiah or Nomadland, I don't know if I like those movies yet. But if I see Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind is playing around Valentine's Day, I'm going to go see it 100 times out of 100 because I know I like it. And guess what? Everybody else who's there also loves that movie. It is exciting. And Sam Raimi arguably is the king of that. Probably Sam Raimi and John Carpenter, right? They're probably the kings of that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. They're definitely those type of directors that encourage that type of behavior, and those cult followings make their movies last. And that's why in 2021 we can be discussing Darkman.
Yeah. Absolutely. 31 years later, huh? We just talked about 2 movies. It makes me sad that we just talked about 2 movies from the early 90s, and one is over 30 years old and the other is almost 30 years old. That really bothers me, John.
Yeah, I'm right there with you, Phil. Don't worry.
Yeah, it's a terrible, terrible feeling. Well, that's good, because at least next week we're going to talk about a movie that you weren't alive for. Neither one of us was alive for when it came out, and the other one is one is only 15 years old. So we're still okay. We're still young. But do you have anything else that you want to add on Darkman before we close this thing out?
No, just I think we covered it all. If you get a chance to see these movies in theaters with people who love these movies, go see them, because that's how these movies are best appreciated. Yeah.
And my final pitch for Barcelona is, if you get a chance to watch it, just watch it, because it certainly won't be playing in a theater anytime soon, unless you rent out an AMC just so you can put it on. But next week, John's number 93rd movie is Wicker Man, the one with Nicolas Cage, right? You love that movie.
Not the one with Nicolas Cage. We're going old school. We've been talking about cult films. Now we're going to watch a film about a cult. Instead, next week with The Wicker Man, the original, and it also has some camp elements to it. It's when I first watched this movie, I was like, "Oh my god, I cannot believe this movie is shot this way." But Christopher Lee in that movie is fantastic, and it is a horrifying movie, and I'm really excited to discuss it next week.
1973. That's the one we're going with. And then I am going to do Borat Make Benefit Glorious Nation of Kazakhstan, or whatever the hell it's called. That is my number 94. 93. Yeah, 93. So that's what we're getting to here. And then we have one more week of normalcy, and then we actually start getting into where we have duplicates, which John and I will talk about not at the end of next week, but the week after that. So we do have plans for the duplicates. As I said tonight, I have another Whit Stillman movie that's not actually on my top 100, but will be being watched at some point during this list. So things start to change, not after next week, not the week after, but in 3 weeks. The format will not change. Just kind of what movies we're talking about might change, because it might not be something that's necessarily on the list. But next week, Borat, easy one to find. The Wicker Man, if you haven't seen it. It's a horror classic. I've never seen it, and I'm very much looking forward to it. I just hope he screams about the bees quite the way that Nicolas Cage does. Anyway. No promises. Okay. Well, anyway, follow Survivor Specialist on Twitter, Instagram, all of that. Alexa's making something happen right now, so we're going to probably have a different look next week when John and I actually start doing this again. But all of that being said, hope you're enjoying. Become a patron. Spread the word about this. Follow us on Letterboxd, J Millsip and P Wood 43. Follow us over there. I've been watching. I think I'm at 68 movies for the year, and I think there's been 68. I think there's only been 68 things, 68 days in this year. For the people who are listening live, thank you so much. JM, check out Barcelona. It's great. John, thanks as always. I'll see you tomorrow for the challenge.
You bet.
I won't be happy about it.